Hey, Tom Bartels from GrowFoodWell.com, where I teach people how to grow nutrient-dense food in small spaces with less work. Right now, I'm out in the garage testing an ingenious and somewhat redneck method for shelling flower corn, and I've got some Hopi blue flower corn here that I'll be shelling in a minute. And at the end of this video, I'll show you why this method is such an incredible time saver. But in general, on this video, I'll be showing you the 5 best methods I know to jumpstart your food garden every year. First, I'll be touching on the 3 types of soil prep: double digging, using a Broadfork, and no-till gardening. And when I start talking about soil management, keep in mind that we're all in different places on that arc of soil management, so you just figure out where you are on that continuum and then choose the method that's most appropriate for your situation. Next, you'll discover why compost is so critical to your success and exactly how it works with the soil food web and why compost makes the best mulch. Timing your planting is also critical to success, so I'll touch on that. Then you'll learn how to combine a few planting techniques that can cut your labor in half and create a garden that you only need to weed once a year. So let's get right into it by starting at the ground level with some of the key concepts that help my workshop students grow organic food at home more easily. Let's look at how most people approach food gardening. Many food gardeners focus on what's going on above the soil in their gardens and react to it above ground, regarding pests and leaves and top growth, etc. And that makes sense because it's part of the growth cycle we can see, so we react to it. But that's usually just a symptom. What's happening below ground is the biggest key to success. This is a drawing of a cabbage root profile. It's about 3 feet of vertical growth. Now, this is a best case scenario in perfectly aerated soil, which is why you've got that 3-foot depth on the roots. But on the right, you'll notice a list of characters that interact with the roots in the soil. The relationships between those microorganisms and the plants is either allowed to happen or not. That's up to the gardener. But let me show you some of the most common ways people prevent this relationship from happening under the soil. Here we have a cross-section of the cabbage root. Now let's look at what happens when it tries to grow in compacted soils. If you're only using the top 8 inches or so of the bed, the plant has a hard time accessing the lower soil profile. The plants are blocked at around the 1-foot depth line here where the brown line is. The roots can't access the lower soil, so then the shallow roots grow left and right and compete with neighboring plants, and you get lower yields. When you aerate and amend the lower part of the soil to about a 2-foot depth, either by double digging or in a framed raised bed, you allow the plant to send roots deeper into the soil, and that deep root growth allows the above-ground portion of the plant to flourish. Soil is alive. You need to feed it, water it, give it cover, and preferably not crush it. You get all this by double digging, which creates aeration in the soil profile, adding compost each season to create humus in the soil, and adding mulch or using the green mulch of intensive plant spacing. Now, I'll talk about intensive plant spacing in a bit, but first let's look at how the basics of double digging works. In traditional raised beds that don't have any physical structures, the beds are basically fluffed up with a garden fork, and compost is added in the process. This introduces space and air between the material and raises the height of the bed by 6 or 8 inches, hence the raised bed. These kinds of beds don't look like much between plantings, but the soil conditions in these beds makes for robust growth. Now, one of the keys to double digging a bed is to keep the top foot of soil from getting put too deeply into the bed. That top foot is where most of the bioactivity takes place, and you want to preserve as much of the integrity of those microorganisms that are in that top foot as possible. So we have a system to aerate the bed down 2 feet, but still leave the top foot of soil on top. Step 1 is to get yourself a digging board to stand on once you get going on the double dig. Any piece of 3/4 inch plywood will work, about 3 or 4 feet wide. This reduces compaction on the bed, which is critical for all finished beds. First, you insert the garden spade fully to start the first trench about 1 foot wide at the top end of the bed. Make sure you keep your legs straight and rock your body weight into the tread of the spade. One key is keeping your heel instep close to the tread on the fork or the spade whenever you step into the soil. And here's the downstroke with a straight leg. The reason I'm being so sensitive to the steps here is that if you do this right with correct body position, you won't hurt your back and it won't be as difficult, so you can do all your beds more efficiently. Then you pry the fork up that loosens the lower foot of soil, And you continue this fork action a foot at a time down the trench, prying it up as you go. Once the bottom foot of the trench is fluffed up, then you add a couple of gallons of finished compost and work it briefly into this lower section of trench. Then you slide the digging board back a foot and repeat. This time, though, you'll be moving the top layer to the previous trench so it stays on top. As you move down the bed, you can rake the surface occasionally to reshape it. Now I add compost to the top of the bed at an application rate of about 5 or 6 5-gallon buckets per 100 square feet of bed. Here I'm working a 100 square foot bed, so I just count 5 or 6 buckets and spread it equally. I usually water it to stabilize everything. And there you go, a double-dug raised bed ready for planting. Now, if you have pretty good soil and it's not rock hard, you don't have to double dig each season. I only do that once every 5 to 8 years or so, depending on the bed conditions. Here's another option. In this picture, I'm using what's called a Broadfork. You actually just step on that big green tread and lean back with your whole body. So basically, that's the whole move on a Broadfork. You just use your whole body weight and kind of back your way down the garden bed. And this is the best way to prep that garden soil. It does not disrupt the microorganisms in the soil very much. It just creates a nice little break in there. And using the Broadfork is just one of the ways to keep the soil aerated and keep it healthy so that those microorganisms in the soil food web can do most of the work for you. And that's how you get gardens like this. Now, these are a little more expensive than a standard garden fork, but they're well worth it, and they're a great tool to go in on with your neighbors or those other people that might be in your garden group, because you only need to use it once or twice a year. For those of you with framed beds, your life is a little bit easier in the spring. Double digging isn't usually necessary since the soil is easier to aerate. But when starting a framed raised bed, be sure to aerate the resident soil below the bed first. And remember to introduce organic compost into that lower layer before you fill the bed with topsoil. And once you do, add more compost to the top 6 inches of the soil and work it in with a garden fork. Now, right about here, people with in-ground garden beds ask me if they really need to go through the double digging process, or can't they just throw some compost on top of the ground and go no-till? And my answer is always, that depends. If you have really good soil to begin with and lots of organic content, like over 10% organic matter, and miraculously you have no compaction in your soil, then I'd say go for it. Add some compost and plant away. But that's rarely the case for most of us. Like you saw a minute ago in those root diagrams, the plants will need to access that lower soil profile in order to get peak growth. So most people initially need to double dig new beds to get aeration and organic matter to that lower level, with the intention to eventually support a no-till situation. That requires some TLC for the beds, like never walking on them and consistently adding compost or cover crops to keep the soil food web alive. Here's a quick example from my garden this past season. This is me shortly after amending the no-till beds with a top layer of compost. Then I left town for about a month and automated the watering while I was gone. When I came back, I stood in the same place and took this photo. Let's try that again. Here are the no-till beds right at planting time and after a month. So you can get great yields with no-till methods, but it may take some time to get your soil to the level where this kind of yield can jump out of your soil each spring. I've been amending these same beds with compost since 2001. You can probably get an average bed to a similar level in about 2 seasons if you pay attention to it. Remember, we're all on this continuum in our food gardening efforts, and a closed-loop, no-till garden is a great target to shoot for. And that all relies on organic compost. That runs the whole game. So let's look at how that works next. Over the past 15 years, in all my food gardening efforts, both at home and at scale on community garden projects of up to 4,000 square feet, the use of compost to build the soil transformed the gardens, and I no longer had to question whether things would work or not. All the gardens got stronger with the annual use of compost. I get consistent, robust growth every year, like this, and this, and this. The microbiology in the soil and the compost creates stable, resilient growth in the gardens and helps strengthen the plant's natural ability to resist pests and disease. So what's happening here is I'm mimicking natural systems to get more consistent yields with less work overall. Now you do this by designing your garden like a forest ecosystem. Compost is the baseline, and biointensive planting methods work in concert with it to create optimal yields in small spaces. I get questions in workshops frequently from people battling diseases and pests, and they're spending a lot of time fighting one scourge or another in the garden. Now, I do help them with specific info on how to fight off this insect or that disease with organic methods, but what I'm usually hesitant to mention to them is I usually don't have to deal with that kind of micromanagement of pests in my gardens. It just doesn't happen to any damaging degree, since the entire system is robust. Now, it kind of sounds like I'm bragging, but I'm not. It's all because the soil food web is doing its job, and everything works better. And I'll get into how that works in a minute. But first, I want to go over the reason compost is a key to growing food well. And to do that, I need to do a brief overview of the soil food web. Now, if you don't know what that is, you should. It's the driving force in ecosystems worldwide. It can supercharge your food garden, it's fueled by compost, and once you understand how it works, it really is kind of magic. I don't have any other words for it. Most people don't realize how powerful a healthy soil food web can be. They usually see the alternative. The consequences of a weak soil food web is what people are used to seeing most often. Many of you have probably experienced or have seen some pretty compacted, sterile soil. Not much seems to grow. It continually dries out, and if any growth does start, the plants never seem to thrive and they quickly go to seed. Much of that is due to the fact that there is very little organic matter in the soil, which increases compaction. It reduces its capacity to hold water and offer nutrients to the plants. Roots have nowhere to go, and they deplete all their energy fighting for limited resources. Weeds take over, and you know the rest. All this stunts the vegetable growth during the season. It also gives plants less access to water, since the roots can't move through the soil as deeply. So the plants are put into stress. And stress in plants creates all kinds of exposures to problems and more work for you. That's when the pests and diseases can attack these weaker plants under stress. So you want to avoid all that. When the bed is deeply worked and amended with compost, the plants have a much easier time getting the resources they need and consequently compete with each other less and grow faster during the season. And fast growth is what you're looking for in garden vegetables, especially in shorter seasons like we have here in Colorado. So soil is alive. You need to feed it, water it, give it cover, and preferably not crush it. It's the same thing with compost, and we'll be getting into that in a minute. In order to expect your garden to grow, you pretty much have to follow the natural law of return. You feed the soil with compost so that it may feed you. So here's why you need to rot everything and feed it back to the soil. This natural law of return simply refers to how the natural biological system of growth, death, decay, and regrowth happens. Many times when soil is in our care, we forget that we are responsible for feeding it, but that's exactly what it needs us to do. There are a surprising number of helpful critters living in the soil. The amount of life in a teaspoon of healthy garden soil is pretty staggering, and even though organic farmers have known for eons how important it is to return organic matter to the soil, it's only recently, with the help of electron microscopes, that scientists have been able to start figuring out what's exactly going on down there. There are over 1 billion bacteria in the average teaspoon of healthy garden soil, including over 10,000 different species of bacteria and fungi in that same teaspoon. Scientists have only identified about 3% of the bacteria and fungi species present, and bacteria and fungi are the baseline of the food chain in the garden soil. There really is an invisible world thriving in garden soil, and much like the microorganisms that keep your digestive tract healthy, they're critical for strength and vitality. This community is commonly referred to as the soil food web, and once you build a healthy soil food web in your garden soil, everything improves. Microorganisms in the soil can prevent disease, attract beneficial insects, feed the plants, extend water to the plants, break down organic matter, strengthen plant growth, and provide resilience. The billions of bacteria and fungi are at the base of the food chain. They consume organic matter in the soil at the smallest level. Then they're preyed upon by the nematodes and protozoa, which are larger creatures, which then excrete wastes that the plants use to nurture growth. But how that system works is pretty fascinating. Here's the cool part. The tips of the plant's roots can actually jettison what are called exudates. These are chemical compounds composed of both proteins and carbohydrates in the form of sugars. This sets in motion a chain of events that's really astounding. And I think it's the single strongest element of my gardening success. So this party's happening all the time in healthy soil. The amazing part is the plants are in control of the process. Their release of exudates varies during the growing season, adjusting to the population type and the numbers of organisms it needs for different nutrients. It controls what nutrients are generated at any one time down there by corralling all these organisms around their roots. So the plants are the orchestra leaders of this whole system. This is basically how most forests work, or grasslands. You don't see anyone running around with liquid fertilizer to keep these plants alive. Forests don't need our help to feed the soil because they drop leaves every season that decompose and feed these organisms. That decaying organic matter keeps the system going. In the case of our veggie garden, you have to create the conditions for this to take place in the first place. You have to initially feed compost to these bacteria in your garden soil, and when you do, you get this. This is a section of beds in my garden this year. I haven't added any plant food or liquid fertilizer. I just worked the soil once in the spring, added the compost, and let it roll. Once you get these natural systems going and there are enough populations of bacteria and fungi feeding on the baseline of the soil food web, you consistently get robust growth like this. And this. You don't have to worry about micromanaging the soil or worrying about NPK levels or pH levels of certain plants or beds. If the plant can grow well in your climate, it will, and it will do so with enthusiasm. The bacteria and fungi are the base building blocks and need to be present in the soil in diverse populations for all of this to occur. So this becomes your main purpose in growing things. You compost as much as possible and return it to the soil. You follow the natural law of return. So all organic matter that comes through your property needs to be recycled back into the soil. The bacteria and fungi feed on organic matter. This is why compost is your friend. Countless organisms work for you year-round if you set things up right. By composting and adding back all the organic material that comes through your life, you increase the fertility of your small area and it becomes regenerative. Anytime you increase the biodiversity and fertility of the soil, you're helping the situation as a whole. So you're actually improving the ecosystem around your home. You're having a positive ecological footprint. So where do you get all these materials to compost in the first place? Now, first you start out by redirecting things that are otherwise thrown out, like kitchen scraps and leaves, grass clippings, and eventually as you grow more food, you have increasing amounts of material from your garden trimmings and chaff that are getting put back into your soil as well. This approach is the goal of closed-loop gardening, where all the compost materials are produced or collected from on-site. One of the first things you need to do is design a funnel to capture that organic material that's being processed through your site. And first, I would recommend cordoning off an area away from your actual garden beds to dedicate to your composting efforts. Use the scale of your yard or property lines to dictate how big it will be, but the more space you have, the better. Here's a note for those people who don't have the room or time to create their own compost, but they want to buy compost to get started. Here's a few pointers on that. Commercially available compost is an unregulated product, so what you buy sometimes is not what you may have expected. When buying compost, it's good to read the labels. Here are some things to look for. When you're starting the garden for the first time and when you want to compost in quantity, you don't want to skimp, so you'll need enough. Think about buying it in bulk by the cubic yard if there's a commercial scale composting facility nearby. Call around to nurseries and they should know if there is one in your particular area. It will be much cheaper and most likely of better quality than buying it in bags. Borrow a friend's truck if you don't have one, or ask the facility if they'll deliver. It will likely still be cheaper that way than buying it by the bag. But for smaller gardens, the bags work fine. The compost you're buying in bulk or bags shouldn't look like its source materials. If it looks like wood chips, it probably is wood chips. Good compost will be dark in color and crumbly like chocolate cake. It should smell earthy but not distasteful, like a forest soil in the spring, not a barnyard in July. Good compost is made up of a number of source materials: animal and bird manures, mushroom waste, leaves, grass, hay, etc. The more diversity, the better the diversity of soil microbes, which makes for stronger compost. Some questionable ingredients. Sludge is one. Some lesser composts are derived from composted sludge, which is a byproduct of municipal sewage plants. There are still many unanswered questions on chemical traces in sewage. To be putting it on your food garden, I would definitely steer away from this kind of bilge. Pesticides. Some compost that is derived from grass clippings, straw, and hay can have herbicide residue that can be very persistent and can negatively affect plant growth in your garden. If grass ingredients are present, see if you can find out if they were grown without herbicides. If they were sprayed with herbicides or pesticides, then move on down the line. Redwood chips can contain chemical growth inhibitors, which should definitely be avoided. You should seek out only organic compost. Look for the OMRI stamp of approval. This will ensure, at least to a greater degree, that you're getting quality materials. But priority one is to make your own. One thing you might notice is that you have to be careful when sourcing compost. Since it's such a crucial element in successful gardening, it's one skill you want to learn how to do for yourself as soon as you can, if you have the space available. Making your own compost ensures that you know what's in it, and it's the most economical way to get it into the garden. Even if you just recycle your kitchen scraps, you can get quite a bit of compost, so the only excuse to not do it is if you don't have room for it. Now, you'll notice that in this shot, I'm spreading compost on top of the soil as mulch. Most of you already know the value of mulch in the garden for saving water and protecting the soil, but instead of using straw, leaves, or other woody mulches, I dedicate some of my compost to use as mulch on all of my beds, because it offers the protective benefits of mulch with the added benefit of continually feeding the soil food web and the plants throughout the season each time it rains, which makes life easier for me and allows me to be away from the garden for long periods during the growing season. Okay, so let's say you've got your soil worked out, you've got a great compost situation, and you want to have a really successful veggie garden this spring. Two concepts for you to remember: space and time. By space, I mean how you space your veggie seeds or seedlings in each bed, which has incredible value, as you'll see in a minute. And by time, I mean you're planting out your seeds or seedlings at the correct time for your climate zone and the variety you're planting. If you get the feel for those two things in your garden, much of your work is simply avoided. Let's look at spacing first. Let's talk about intensive spacing and how it creates what's called a living mulch. Once you get your garden beds to the point that they're deeply amended and can support intensive spacing of your plants, you get the added advantage of this living green mulch, and once all the leaf canopies touch, your veggie plants outcompete all the weeds. This saves you a ton of work. That's a key point right there. Simply by using intensive spacing on your vegetables, you can cut your weeding down so that you only have to weed once a year, right before the canopies touch. There are other benefits as well. By having this living mulch, you actually create a beneficial microclimate under the canopy on each bed. This keeps the soil cooler, conserves water, keeps weeds at bay, and moderates temperature swings. Now, this diagram shows a couple different routes for intensive spacing of the vegetables in your bed. On the left is the maximum planting diagram for getting the absolute most amount in any bed. Each vegetable has a specific plant spacing requirement. Some are 2 inches apart in all directions. Other larger plants are up to 18 or 24 inches apart. It's all based on how big the leaf canopy of that particular species gets during its adolescence. What you're trying to create is a bed with plant canopies that will cover the bed from all sides. But I wanted to show you what I gravitated to later on, after using the spacing on the left for years. To minimize my work requirements in the garden, I have switched now to drip lines, which makes my life much easier. If I planted with the maximum pattern on the left with the triangles, it's hard to hit all the plants with water without overhead watering, which I was willing to do for years, but then I shifted to the planting pattern on the right using the same vegetable spacing, but keeping them in line with the drip lines at the same spacing. It isn't the maximum amount I could plant, but the canopy touches, and it's the optimum density for me, since my drip lines water each plant, and I don't have to drag the hose around every day and try to get water to every plant in between. Here's an example of some young eggplants at the drip line spacing. Notice they're staggered so each plant canopy will eventually fill in the space between the other plants. And here's an example with basil seedlings in line with the drip hoses. Here's the same basil about 60 days later. So you'll notice that this basil is doing great after 60 days. Now part of that is due to the soil management and the spacing, but as I mentioned earlier, timing has a whole lot to do with it. When you plant is as important as what you plant. Let me talk about that for a second. Success in the garden as it relates to timing starts with choosing the right veggie varieties that grow well in your particular climate zone. If you have only a 140-day growing season like I do, you don't want to plant something that has a 160-day growth cycle. With that in mind, once you get used to what plants do well in your area, you want to be vigilant on getting them in the right date before or after the hard frost dates in the spring. That allows your plants the maximum amount of time to get to full maturity before autumn frost shuts things down. If you're not paying attention to those frost dates, you're just creating more work for yourself down the road. The best way to do that is to find frost dates for your particular area or as close as possible. Then check your seed packets to see what the recommended planting time is. It's always based on the time before or after the frost dates. So once you have yours, you can see the correct planting times for each vegetable. Really, it's that easy. I can't tell you the number of times I have students ask me what's going on in their garden when they have spindly plant growth or they have weeds that take over. Things just aren't working out very well. And I start by asking them what their planting schedule was. It turns out they didn't have one. They didn't pay attention to frost dates, and they might have been planting way too early or way too late for that particular plant variety, and they never gave the plant a chance. It's sort of like me waking you up at 2 in the morning and having you run outside in a snowstorm in your underwear, right? It's going to create immediate stress. So it's the same for plants. Rather than shocking them and creating all these negative spirals that come from a plant that's stressed out, you have to pay attention to their timing sweet spot. And once you do that, things get much easier. And speaking of making things easier, let me show you what I've got going with this flower corn. Now, as some of you may know, I grow this Hopi Blue flower corn each year, and I grind the flour for cornmeal pancakes all winter long. And for those of you who also grow flower corn, you know that when you end up with more than 100 or so ears from a single 100 square foot bed, which is relatively easy to do, you still need to shell all those ears of corn so that it can be stored more easily. Now, I used to do this by hand simply by twisting the ear with a gloved hand, and it takes the kernels off a little bit at a time, and it's incremental. It does work, but it takes a fair bit of effort. So the way this works is we got to get all these ears of corn into kernels, so that we're going to drop the kernels into that bucket there. But instead of doing that whole twist by hand method, we're going to use a couple tools. Here's all you need is a common household drill. Any old drill will work, as long as it's got power. And I have a 1/4-inch drill bit on this. Any drill bit will work pretty much. And we're also going to need a pair of channel locks, or a monkey wrench as it's called. Any channel locks or something similar will work. And you'll notice how I've got that opening that's pretty wide. So it's going to be just a little wider than an average ear of corn that fits in there. So I'll turn it so you can see it here. We're going to be using that to just guide the drill down, and it'll be self-explanatory once you see this work. So you're going to open that channel locks pretty wide so that it's about the size of an ear of corn. First thing you do is you take the back of the corn and you go ahead and set that drill in. Just like that. So now we've got a piece of corn on the end of a drill, and I'm going to start at the bottom end, so I have to reduce this channel locks just a touch, and I'm going to lightly, I'm not cranking on this at all on the monkey wrench side, I'm just going to lightly touch that and watch what happens. Take about 3 seconds, pull it back out, and then you're done with that. Okay? Let's try that again. So you drill it straight up the back of the corn, just till it takes a bite in there. Go ahead and put your channel locks down low.
back out the drill. There you go. So the trick is you want to have this channel locks open wider than it needs to be, and then instead of worrying about clamping down on it, you just angle it back like this. So you're just drifting it at an angle and moving it up the ear as you move the drill. So in practice it looks like this. Notice I'm not squeezing this or having to clamp down on the kernel at all. It moves freely up and down, and to tighten it, to get the kernels to fall off, you just turn it just a little bit so it's coming up at an angle. Technically, you can store corn on the ear and it lasts actually even longer on the ear, but it does take up a considerable amount of space if you have hundreds of ears. So that's why people take it off and store it in kernel form in glass, and it'll last several years that way. But what you don't want to do is grind it all up and leave it in a ground state, because once you grind it, you expose the inside of the kernel to air and bacteria, and then it starts breaking down, which is why cornmeal that you buy in the store tends to taste rancid, because it's been ground up and left exposed to oxygen and bacteria. And once you've tasted really good fresh cornmeal, there's no going back. So I'll winnow this, and I'll put it in a bowl and just do a brief winnowing to get rid of the chaff, and then I'll store it in glass jars. And then just grind it up as you need it throughout the winter for either cornmeal pancakes, or any recipes for corn tortillas or anything else you might be making. That's just about all the time I have today, so thanks for listening, and I hope some of these tips and methods have helped you learn ways to make your food gardening efforts that much more successful this spring. And if you're interested in a more detailed gardening workshop, there should be a link somewhere on this page, so click that link for more information. And otherwise, get out there and grow some food.